A lot of what I have planned this spring is based on meals I can cook once, then pull out from the freezer or pantry on busy nights. I garden in Ontario's Zone 6 with an about 150-day growing season. My last frost is around May 15th and my first frost is around October 10th. So spring matters a lot around here. What I plant now determines what we will be able to eat fresh, how much I will be able to preserve, and how close I will get to my overall harvest goals for the year. Most of my vegetables are grown in my backyard, which is my main production area. About 230 square feet dedicated to growing annual vegetables. I also grow food in a berry bed and some containers, which adds about another 120 square feet. And I also tuck vegetables into a couple of the small spaces in my front yard perennial beds for another 36 square feet. It is not a huge garden, but it is enough space that every planting decision really matters. I always start with the crops that take up the most space, then shape everything else from there. For me, one of those crops is potatoes, and honestly, I can't imagine my garden without some potato plants. This year, I'm aiming for about a 72-pound harvest, which means I'll be planting 48 seed potatoes. That being said, even though potatoes are high yielding, I put a hard limit on how much space they get in my garden. They would have to increase a lot in price before they got any more space than this. I'm planting them in 2 of my 3 tall raised beds at about 1 seed potato per square foot. My in-ground soil is very clay-like and heavy, and I have found that potatoes just don't do well in it. Because potatoes are the plant's tubers themselves, they really benefit from loose soil, and my raised beds can do a much better job of providing that. Another anchor crop for me in the spring is broccoli. I'm aiming for about a 23-pound broccoli harvest this spring, which works out to about 56 broccoli plants. One of the reasons I prioritize broccoli is nutrition. Homegrown broccoli holds on to more of its vitamin C and other nutrients, because it goes straight from the garden to our plates or into the freezer very quickly. That makes it feel especially worth the space it takes up. Broccoli does best for me in-ground, so I give it most of my large in-ground bed and all of my front yard vegetable space. I also had a small area to fill in the front and back sections of my small in-ground bed, so a few broccoli plants are going there as well. I also like planting broccoli in larger groups. It is easier for pest management. It is simpler to care for all the plants at once than a few scattered plants throughout the garden. When I step back and look at the plan at this point, about 170 square feet of my 267 square foot vegetable garden is already spoken for. Roughly 64% of my spring growing space is decided, and everything else needs to work around that. Once the big crops are decided, that's when my planning really shifts. Instead of thinking in terms of individual vegetables, I start thinking about the meals I'd like to prepare. Because if I'm going to take the time and energy to grow my own food, I want to turn it into dinners I can rely on. Meals I can cook once and then pull straight from the freezer or the pantry on a busy night. Since I already have potatoes in my spring plan, the first question I ask myself is, what meals do we like to eat that include potatoes? The first one that comes to mind is beef stew. When I make beef stew, I use potatoes, carrots, and onions. And luckily, all 3 of those crops grow well together during the springtime. So once potatoes were in the plan, carrots and onions naturally followed. Another way we eat lots of potatoes is in gnocchi. I like to make purple gnocchi because of the added nutrition from the beets. So that decision added beets to the list. Then there's chicken pot pies, one of my favorite pull from the freezer into the oven dinners. For those, I use carrots, onions, and peas. I already had carrots and onions planned, so I just needed to add peas to complete that set. Once I knew the meals I wanted to make, I had to work backwards to figure out how much of each crop I would need. I'm aiming to make 26 chicken pot pies and 21 beef stews. In order to do that, I need roughly 18.5 pounds of carrots, 18 pounds of potatoes, 14 pounds of onions, and about 8 pounds of peas. I already knew my potato plan would cover that, so it was just about working the rest of the crops into the garden. For carrots, that worked out to just under 150 carrots total. Based on how densely I plant them, that worked out to about 17 square feet of carrots. I added an additional square foot of carrots so that we could have some for fresh eating. Carrots are a root crop, so loose soil really matters. I'm putting half of them in my remaining tall raised bed and the other half along the front of my shorter L-shaped raised bed. Onions are similar. For prepared meals alone, I need about 14 pounds, but I use onions consistently in everyday cooking. So I plan for closer to 40 pounds of onions. That works out to about 20 square feet of onions. They also prefer loose soil, so they will be staying in the raised beds. Split between the 2 raised beds, same as the onions. Peas are next. Shelling peas need a trellis, so I'm planning a 5-foot row along the trellis in my L-shaped raised bed. I've never grown shelling peas before, but planted densely, I'm estimating about 8 pounds from that space. For fresh eating, I also like snap peas, so I'm planting another 5-foot row in the front of my large in-ground bed. That spot won't get shaded, which was an issue with my snap peas last year. And that spot faces my kitchen window, and peas are a beautiful crop to look at in the spring. I'm estimating about 3 pounds of snap peas there. For the gnocchi, I'm aiming for about 10 pounds of beets. Based on my spacing and past yields, that works out to about 10 square feet. Root crops do best for me in raised beds, so I'm filling the rest of the one tall raised bed with beets. I'm also going to experiment with planting beets between my tomatoes along the trellis to see how that works. Speaking of tomatoes, I'm actually cutting back this year. Last year, I grew 18 plants, and this year I'm cutting it back to 14. Even with fewer plants, I'm estimating a harvest of around 140 pounds. I single stem my tomatoes, so they'll all need support. 8 plants will go along the trellis planted between the beets, and the other 6 will go on the north end of the middle section of my smaller in-ground bed, growing up tomato spirals. I'm also trying something a little different this year with my arch trellises. I'm planting 4 cherry tomatoes on my front arch trellis. Normally I would plant green beans there, but birds caused problems with my green beans last year, and they seem to leave my cherry tomatoes alone. It's also much easier to bag a cluster of tomatoes than it is to cover a whole trellis with netting. From those 4 plants, I'm estimating a harvest around 20 pounds. That leaves my back arch trellis, and this year it's going to be for melons. I grew cantaloupe for the first time last year, and my sons absolutely loved it. Cantaloupe takes a long time to mature, so I want to get it into the garden as early as possible. I may end up doing 1 cantaloupe on one side of the trellis and a watermelon on the other side of the trellis, but either way, that trellis is going to be for melons. My son's only request from the garden this year was watermelon, so if you have any growing tips, I'll happily take them. Once the main meal crops are planted, I start thinking about fresh eating. What do we like to eat regularly from the garden while it's producing? Lettuce is an easy one. I'm planting 24 lettuce plants along the front center section of my smaller in-ground bed, where it is easy to harvest weekly. That should give me about 8 pounds of lettuce from that planting, and I'll do some succession planting later in the season as well. For cabbage, I'm planting a dwarf variety between the tomatoes and the lettuce in that same bed, and a larger cabbage variety along the path in my front yard garden. Altogether, I'm estimating a yield of about 14 pounds of cabbage. Then there's what I think of as filler crops. In the spring, my go-to are radishes, green onions, and arugula. They are fast growing and flexible. I will put them in the garden anywhere I see bare soil. Between onions and tomatoes, between broccoli and cabbage, wherever there's room to keep the soil working. By the time July rolls around, many of these spring crops will be finished. If all goes well, I should have harvested 200 pounds towards my 650 pound goal. And that doesn't even include tomatoes or melons yet because they won't be ready until later in the summer. Now you might be thinking there's still a big gap between 200 and 650. But remember, tomatoes alone account for 160 pounds, and that harvest doesn't really show up until later in the summer. And if you're looking at this plan and thinking, where are the sweet peppers, the squash, the beans, and the Brussels sprouts? Remember at the beginning how I talked about how potatoes and broccoli are taking up 64% of my spring growing space, but will be out of the garden by early to mid-July? That's where succession planning comes in. When the weather gets hot, which most of these crops absolutely love, the space opens up just in time. And with my first frost not being until October 10th, I can keep using the same beds well into the season. In my next video, I'll walk you through my succession plan.